Chapter 8. Whenever Nick went out to smoke, he still saw Vash across the street, working. The shared waves felt wildly different now. His stomach flipped every time, and he had to argue with himself internally that he couldn't go over there right now. There was work to do. Work, damn it. Work. He'd be filling out a cause of death form and his brain would wander off into the greenhouse. Thinking about flower arrangements became thinking about potted plants, became thinking about soil, became thinking about how Vash smelled, earthy under the warmth and sweat. The discoloration of his fingernails because of the dirt that always clung to them, the taste of sugar on his... And then Nick's phone would ring, or there would be a knock on his door, and he would jerk out of it like he'd been tased. They'd already taken to texting, but that felt different now too. Less of a friendly testing the waters, and more of an outstretched hand, or a head bowed next to his, sharing something private. Vash liked memes and cute animals. Nick should have known. But he definitely didn't hate it, his phone buzzing at random intervals with a picture of a screaming possum or a baby otter. "Computers hate me so much," Vash would say. "Kite won't let me use the register again." "They know you're a biosupremacist," Nick told him. "I am not. Just because biology is better than computer science in every way—" "Shh, the phone can hear you," Nick typed, smirking. Late on Thursday, Vash texted, "What do you want to do tomorrow night?" Nick resisted the obvious response of you. Vash preempted him to an answer anyway. "I know you aren't big on movies, but there's a new entry out in this action trash franchise I love. Explosions and popcorn?" Nick smiled at his phone. "Just because I haven't watched a lot doesn't mean I don't like them," he replied. "How confused will I be?" "Nothing to be confused about when the plots already make no sense," Vash said. "Then I'm in," Nick typed. Vash sent popcorn emojis, and Nick had to lay his face on his arms at his desk because Vash couldn't be a bigger dork, and it was truly a problem how okay Nick was with that. Nick waited outside the side door of the garden center on Friday evening, as the sun sank and the shadows lengthened. When Vash came outside, Nick hefted his newest accessory to show off, a dark red motorcycle helmet. Vash flashed a huge grin. Vash had a small backpack slung over one shoulder. It wasn't too big, just enough to shove in a change of clothes, maybe some toiletries. Nick's mouth went dry when he put two and two together. Vash fiddled with the strap. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked, seeing Nick looking. "I would mind way more if you wanted to come over but not stay," Nick said honestly, and Vash went pink and grinned. Nick had a cable lock for his helmet, and he was pretty sure he could fit it through two visors in the backpack straps. But realistically, he might need to start looking at buying panniers or something. Maybe upgrade to Angelina 2? Some model with better seating for riding 2 up, and which didn't crap out on him every few months. He'd been thinking about trading in for a while. Vash's presence wasn't the only impetus, although he made for convenient excuse to spend some time drooling over bike shopping. They got to the theater early, which was good. It was packed. Nick's only real exposure to theaters in his childhood had been on rare special occasions when Miss Melanie managed to scrape enough together to take all the kids to something age-appropriate. At the early bird showing, with a group discount on top of that. And only after a movie had been out for a long time, so that the theater might be mostly empty. Tonight, Vash insisted on paying for everything, and Nick suffered some 20 years too late sticker shock at the realization of how much Melanie had spent to take him and all the other snot rags to those kids' movies he couldn't even remember. This was the full theater experience like Nick had never done it before, first due to poverty, and then out of habit. Opening night, overpriced concessions, peak hours ticket prices, crowded auditorium, and a movie that actually benefited from a huge screen and surround sound the way kids' cartoons usually didn't. And on top of all that, a date. A date who laughed and leaned over to whisper explanations in Nick's ear every now and then, breath sweet and salty and problematically tempting. They sat towards the back of the theater, and after a while, Nick blatantly neglected to pay attention to the film in favor of wrapping an arm behind Vash's shoulders and pretending to lean in for a whisper, only to gently mouth at Vash's neck and ear. Around some popcorn, corners of his eyes crinkling, Vash casually murmured, "The more you tease now, the more I have to pay back later." Nick hurriedly sat back and minded his own business. Vash snickered while someone behind them shushed him. Afterward, just like with the kids' movies from 20 years ago, Nick could not have said a single thing that actually happened in the film, and yet it was still one of the best times he'd ever had. Vash talked animatedly about the movie as they left the theater. Nick paid for a late dinner at the one good ramen place he knew. Nick explained the roadblocks that had kept him from watching much TV or movies. Usually money. Almost always money. But dropped names of things he'd always wanted to see, things everyone seemed to understand inherently, which made him feel left out. I kind of started out hating everything, Vash said, sipping his drink. I resented being trapped in bed so much, and the TV was just there, but everything I watched I associated with being miserable. I still can't really watch Hitchcock movies. I know they're good, academically. He gestured at his temple. But they make me remember being nauseous from the meds I was on. Things got better when I went from thrillers to just uncomplicated, low-stakes stuff. Old sitcoms. Bewitched, I Love Lucy, things like that. Clearly you've recovered, Nick said dryly. If anything was going to make you nauseous, you'd think what we just watched would do it. Vash laughed. Yeah, I came back around, he said. Pretty much everything I watched came out of a bargain bin. There were those box sets that had like 50 movies for $5. So that's where the love of atrocious action movies started. Eventually, technology had rolled along and streaming services had overtaken the world, of course. But Vash revealed that his favorites from the old bargain bin days were the DVDs now occupying the milk crate shelf at his house. Show me something you love, Nick said. Movie night. Vash could not have looked more transcendently happy to be asked. Later, much later, 1:45 in Nick's bedroom, Nick kissed Vash's hip bone, following it down the cut of his upper thigh, toward his legs sprawled open in invitation. Vash softly moaned as Nick spread his palms against the inside of his thighs. Then Vash made a smaller sound in the back of his throat, a quick that did not sound like pleasure. Nick glanced up and saw him wincing, hand going to his opposite shoulder. You okay? Sorry, Vash said. Nick leaned up and gave Vash's hip a little flick. No sorry, he said. Just tell me if you're okay. Yeah, I'm fine. Vash let out a shaky breath. I'm just tensing in ways I don't usually, he said with a vague laugh. Makes stuff spasm. Nick started, You gonna be okay to... Vash lifted onto his elbow and glared. If you don't finish what you started, I swear to God, he all but growled. Nick's concern drained away. Vash's erection hadn't wavered a bit, so if Vash said muscle spasms be damned, then muscle spasms be damned. Nick got back to it. A respectable amount of time later, Nick laid curled up with Vash in the center of the bed, both of them drowsy and wrung out. He wasn't sure if that was Vash's first blowjob, received or given, most likely both, but he suspected it had been. Vash still wouldn't fully elaborate on his prior experience or lack thereof, but Nick had no interest in forcing him to tell. Where he lacked experience, he made up in enthusiasm and stamina. The latter, Nick suspected, came from a combination of being over 30 and having had plenty of, self-guided tours. How's the shoulder? Nick asked sleepily, nosing against the shoulder in question. Vash scratched his fingers lightly through the hair on the back of Nick's head. If he would simply never stop doing that, that would be ideal. Oh, all good. It's my neck, really. Chaps get all naughty because of the arm and the heavy lifting. Go easier on yourself, Nick told him. Vash chuckled. Hey, I got it easy. Living on Easy Street. Like hell. Nick breathed in Vash's scent and then pushed himself up on an elbow. Hey, turn over. Vash grumbled in complaint at being asked to move, but he did it anyway. He settled on his front, face turned off the edge of the pillow. What are you... Nick reached across Vash's shoulders to the far trapezius muscle and smoothed his hand over it firmly before giving it a squeeze. Vash grunted and winced a little. His neck muscles were like gravel in the shape of a person. Damn, Spiky, Nick muttered, kneading again more gently. I don't know about... Ha! Vash let out a sharp breath against the pillow. Nick froze. Was that a bad No, do the thing again. Nick did the thing again. Vash made a very encouraging noise, and his shoulders visibly shuddered and relaxed. After a while, Nick shifted all the way upright and straddled Vash's legs, put both hands to work. God, subtract 10 years and he'd already be hard again, but the last hour had really taken it out of him. Vash had an incredible ass, which his wardrobe of beat-up old work jeans did nothing for. Nick enjoyed the view while he rendered Vash's shoulders and upper back into pliable putty. Have you never gotten a massage? Nick asked. Vash whined into the pillow, muffled. Just seems like something that should go with the physical therapy territory, Nick said. Vash tilted his head sideways and said, If warm-up and cool-down stretches were like this, I'd have been kicked out of PT years ago. Nick smirked, rolling his hips and digging his thumbs along Vash's shoulder blades. After another minute of ruining Vash for massage forever, Nick bent over his back and started kissing his shoulders instead, hands moving down to Vash's lower back and waist. "This seems," Vash panted, "very unprofessional for a masseuse." He pressed his hips back and up into Nick's reawakening erection. "I'm just a hobbyist," Nick shot back, grinning against Vash's skin. "Let me turn over." "Give me a good reason," Nick teased. "'Cause if you don't, one of us is going to be sleeping in the wet spot, and it won't be me," Vash sniped. "Oh, won't it?" Nick parried, but he shifted his weight up so Vash could move anyway. Vash twisted around. The moment he was on his back, he hooked his arm around Nick's neck and his opposite leg around Nick's hip and dragged him down. Afterwards, collapsed in a boneless, sweaty heap all over again, Vash dreamily said, "I'm gonna make you watch Star Wars." Nick hummed, halfway to sleep already. He fumbled out to the side of the bed for the lamp cord. Vash rolled close to him, cuddled up to his shoulder, and murmured, "It's my favorite thing." The room plunged into darkness. Nick shifted himself more comfortable, got his arm over Vash's waist, and started drifting off. "'Kay," he sighed. "Second favorite thing," Vash mumbled, and then he was out like a light. Nick didn't have much time to wonder what that meant before he followed. A week passed. 2. Vash stayed over at Nick's place twice more, but declined once. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he had felt uneasy all that day, and he felt he needed to be home with his brother. The next day, he bemoaned to Nick how Knives had berated him for being mopey and insufferable all night, and had told him that if he was going to sit around sighing forlornly while watching Cary Grant movies and eating a whole tub of coconut-based ice cream, then Knives would happily kick him to the curb so he could just walk to Nick's place. Nick just laughed at him and threw an arm around his shoulders, tugged his head down to plant a kiss on his temple. "You're hopeless," he said. Vash pushed his shoulder, but not too hard. He was clearly happy with the cuddle. Public displays of affection were a slippery issue. They didn't go by any hard and fast rules. Vash was a tactile person, which Nick had already known anyway. He hugged just about anyone who stood still for too long. Now, when he hugged Nick, it was usually accompanied by a smack on the face somewhere, not always on the mouth. But that still wasn't too much different from normal friendly Vash. Nick's only inclination was to want to hold Vash's hand when he could, like if they were walking to the bakery or to the diner. Beyond that, he didn't feel too easy with being publicly touchy. Vash still jogged across the street to visit when Nick came outside to smoke, and in the half-hidden shade of the carport was the only place Nick would kiss him properly. Vash jokingly complained he was going to pick up a nicotine addiction just from kissing Nick. Nick told him if he did, he was buying his own cigarettes because the damn things were expensive. Vash told him he should quit. Nick said he'd tried, and that Vash should respect his current 4 to 6 a day habit because it used to be 20 or more. Vash kissed him again and again then, and said, "I respect you," and Nick went a little funny in the head. Nick took as many opportunities as he could to return Vash's visits, spending most of his lunch breaks these days across the street at the garden center. Eventually, they both had to concede that they couldn't eat out for every meal. It was too expensive. So Nick would bring either a pack of ramen or whatever Tupperware Brad had shoved into his hands and join Vash in the back of the greenhouse or the offices to eat. Vash's homemade lunches were usually rice, veggies, and tofu in some form or other, although sometimes he snuck in shrimp, and he'd put his finger to his lips and tell Nick, "Shh, he hasn't noticed the bag in the freezer yet." The back offices of the garden center were just 3 cramped rooms behind the counter. The only one with a window contained a counter, table, chairs, microwave, mini-fridge, and a lot of homely but mismatched decorations, clearly all brought in by Vash, Kite, and Elizabeth. The windowsill was crowded with baby succulents and small solar-powered plastic toys that bounced or swayed in the sun. The middle room was storage for plants that didn't like sunlight. Nick discovered the source of his office plants, because there were about a dozen of the same types back there, most of them bigger and taller than the ones he still faithfully watered. It was like a rainforest in a room. Vash explained that they split the roots of these every now and then to propagate new ones, which were the smaller versions for sale and shopping area up front. The third back room was the only actual office, and it was where Knives more or less lived. Nick hadn't really put his finger on it before now, but he had always found it strange that although both twins owned and worked never-ending hours at the garden center, he only ever saw the one twin actually doing anything. Well, here was Knives' lair. 2 large computer monitors for what looked to be a pretty powerful tower, a ton of corkboards covered in a ton of pen paperwork, a desk meticulously organized and covered with everything Nick could think of for running a business. There was a safe in the corner, a stack of cash boxes, a money-counting machine, spare rolls of change. The door had a window in it so Nick could see all this in passing, but the door itself was always closed. Almost every time Nick came over, Knives was sat in there, bathed in the glow of monitor light and crunching some numbers or other with his resting bitch face. The one time Knives glanced up and saw Nick looking, he actively glared. Vash, who was standing next to Nick at that moment, pulled one of his lower eyelids down and stuck his tongue out. Knives switched the glare over to Vash. Vash rapidly made the sign language gestures for I love you. Knives pointed toward the break room and mouthed, go away. While he heated up some soup, Nick said, so it's probably for the best that he's not in the front of house, huh? Vash laughed. Yeah, there's a tarped-off part of the greenhouse he works in, too, he said. I can get pretty much anything to grow how it wants to, but he's the master of making things grow how he wants them to. So he does the things like force-blooming mums, getting miniature fruit trees to put out. He's got a couple of bonsai trees back there, but that's just a personal project, not for sale. And he fills up your house with experiments, Nick said. Mm-hmm. Vash took a big bite of his lunch. That's kind of new. He's doing color-crossing experiments with flowers. Vash swallowed. He's never been into flowers much before. They're not practical enough. Except as food for pollinators. He's definitely never cared about colors. Nick brought his hot food to the table and sat down. So what's that painting on your door at your house? Vash's eyes widened briefly, as though he'd forgotten Nick had seen that. Oh, He smiled softly, one of his real smiles. I painted that when we moved in. For fun. Knives didn't want to paint any of the rooms. I was thinking about some bright colors. Paint the kitchen red or something. He just wanted to leave it all white. Nick frowned at his soup. He shouldn't get to decide things unilaterally like that, he said. No, it wasn't like that. Concessions were made on both sides, I promise. Vash poked at his food. I think I've said before, we were just coming out of a weird time. We hadn't seen each other for years, and then I was the one who went to him, and there was a lot of fighting. His eyes pinched at the corners. It wasn't good. Nick didn't say anything, but the specter of Knives' current problem hung over the conversation. Bad people, Vash had said. Bad people could mean so many things, but the options were limited by the fact that apparently these people were bad in an of interest to the police sort of way. In a crossing state lines might be a felony sort of way. Nick had a hard time imagining Vash fighting. Vash angry. Vash scared. No, he could imagine Vash scared. He'd seen an echo of Vash's fear already. The image flashed through his memory of Vash in the park, looking out at the lake and saying, I almost lost him once. He came with me, Vash said quietly, and looked up from his lunch to catch Nick's eyes. As if pleading with Nick to understand, to give his blessing, Vash said, When I asked him to, Knives left what he was doing and came with me. He stopped. I asked him to stop, and he stopped. So I can live with white walls. Nick let out a long breath. Okay, he said, trying to be mollifying. So he gave up a lot for you. Does he appreciate what you gave up for him? Vash said, yes. Nick tried to decide if he'd imagined the fractional hesitation before the word. But he just said, good, he'd better. And he smiled at Vash, because smiling was Vash's way out, and Nick wanted to offer him an escape. Vash took it, expression softening back to his usual degree of upbeat. The flowers on your door? Nick prodded again, digging into his soup. Oh, yeah, geraniums, Vash said cheerfully. I just like 'em. They were Rem's favorite. I don't know if I call them my all-time favorite. I really love a daffodil. And a hyacinth. Spring flowers. Spring's my favorite season. And he was off, chattering about whatever came into his head. Vash slept over again, and for once they got to wake to a morning when Nick didn't have to go to work, and Vash could put work off until later. It had been a cold night, the first night of the year to dip below 30 degrees. Vash had seemed slower lately, his sunshine a little dimmer. The night before he'd been energetic enough, but as Nick blinked blearily awake and ran his hand down Vash's side, wrapping around his back and dropping a few suggestive kisses over his shoulders, Vash didn't stretch and smile and turn over like usual. He just made a soft sound in the back of his throat and tugged Nick closer, less like a lover and more like a heated blanket. You okay? Nick murmured. Sore, said Vash. Nick frowned against his neck. They hadn't done anything the night before to be sore about. He made a questioning noise. Don't do so good in the cold, Vash mumbled. His scars. Right. They didn't hurt to the touch, he'd said, but given the right weather conditions, they could ache so badly Vash could struggle to take a full breath. Nick pulled the blankets higher, curled tight to Vash, and tried to will more heat into the bed. He couldn't see Vash's face, but he could hear the smile when Vash whispered, "Thanks." Back when Vash had been hiding his arm, he'd said circulation problems as a deflection, but it wasn't completely a lie either. His prosthetic never really warmed up, and even though he had thicker, warmer socks to pull over his stump before attaching it, the chill always managed to seep through. As the days ticked over into December, he wore thermal undershirts, multiple layers, sometimes even 2 pairs of gloves. Yet he was always shivering a little, eager to get into warm spaces like the diner or the garden center's back rooms or Nick's apartment. Neither of them were May City natives. Nick, being from somewhere far colder, found the weather in May to be temperate to balmy, even in winter. On the other hand, Vash hailed from hot, dry plains that were barely shy of desert. May's damp, cloudy, drizzly winters were not kind to him. The garden center itself also gradually sank into as much of a slump as its owner. Nick hadn't really thought about it before, but obviously business was seasonal there. The greenhouse itself slowly emptied out until there was nothing but a couple of rows of houseplants. Apparently, both twins agreed wholeheartedly on disliking the whole culture of disposable holiday plants, so they didn't mess with trees or poinsettias. Chrysanthemums in the fall were their only concession to holidays, really. The interior of the shop building filled up with ornaments and little gift items on consignment from local artists, and the wall of jars of preserves did some decent turnaround, but otherwise, the place started to feel almost shut down. In the second week of December, Elizabeth even bowed out to take an extended vacation with her family. They simply didn't need any staff, and wouldn't again until February, maybe even March. And it didn't help either Vash or Nick's moods that on the other side of the street, business was picking up. More people died in the winter. Plain, unfortunate fact. Older folks struggled more with their health problems. The roads were perpetually slicker and less safe. Depression crept through windows with the chill, seeped into people's minds, made them hopeless. Nick wished he didn't know as much as he did about suicide statistics. He wished he didn't sometimes have to tell Andrea, the cosmetician, that this or that service was going to be closed casket, so she didn't need to worry about disguising a head wound. The only good thing about winter at the funeral home was that Nick finally got to meet their liaison from the homeless shelter downtown. He was a bald man in a wheelchair who went by Hop, and Nick liked him instantly. Hop had absolutely no time for niceties, an almost fanatical attitude toward logistics, and he knitted all his own hats and gloves. He also had arms like tree trunks and played wheelchair basketball in his free time. If Nick thought Hop was pretty cool, it was nothing compared to how fast Hop and Livio clicked. They were comparing notes about their respective military tours within minutes, and by the end of an hour, Livio had been invited to Hop's next game. The downside was, of course, why Hop was even there in the first place. People without homes or with inadequate shelter were in constant danger in the winter. Hop had spent several years homeless in May in the past, and he knew just about everyone who lived rough downtown. He had brought in a little info on a handful of people he was worried about this year. Conrad Chappell handled deceased John and Jane Does for the city hospital, and Hop just wanted to be sure he was notified if any turned up, in case he might recognize them. Definitely not a feel-good job, Nick thought after Hop had left. He leafed through the few sheets of paper Hop had handed him, looking at grainy pictures of people he might meet his bodies one day. On the last page was a lanky teen, with user, needs asthma inhaler, handwritten next to his picture. Nick put the papers down, overwhelmed, and texted Vash. Seen any cute otters lately? Vash sent a video. Nick watched it, rubbed the watery fog from his eyes, and smiled. 2 weeks before Christmas. The day was heavily overcast, the dark sky already leaking the beginnings of what promised to be a miserable downpour later, probably a sleet storm overnight. A steady, biting wind blew trash and dead leaves in a constant stream down the street. Even going out onto the carport to smoke, sheltered as it was a disgusting experience. At lunchtime, Nick pulled up his collar, buried his face in his scarf, and braved the walk across the street. He'd already talked Vash into going over to the diner for lunch. Not as if that had been difficult. Quinoa and zucchini, or whatever the hell was in the break room fridge, or Lob's famous clam chowder. Nick was pretty sure Vash would happily commit crimes for that chowder. He almost bumped into someone else approaching the garden center door at the same time. "Sorry," he said automatically, stepping back to let her have the right-of-way, before pausing and realizing that he knew who he was looking at. Even though she was thoroughly covered up in a long fur coat and matching pillbox hat, with a fluffy white scarf and huge sunglasses. She murmured, "Excuse..." Then she paused and lowered her sunglasses to look at him better. "Ah, Mr. Wolfwood. Pleasure to meet you again." "You too, Miss Rousseau," Nick said. He hesitated, but then, feeling like she might be the old-fashioned sort, he stepped forward and pulled the door open for her. Her red lips quirked up in a little grin at the gesture. "Merci," she said, and went in. Kite sat on a stool behind the counter, popping bubblegum and scrolling on his phone. He looked up when the door opened, mouth open to say something, but at the sight of the two of them, he just sighed and rolled his eyes. He hopped off the chair and stuck his head through the door to the back, hollering, "Boss! Other boss! It's for both of you." Vash popped out almost instantly, coat already on. Or rather, both coats. He'd taken to layering a long parka on top of the peacoat. And he'd finally had to concede a loss in the battle for his hairstyle, too. He couldn't spike it and also wear a hat, and he hated the cold far too much to sacrifice warmth for style. He had what Nick privately thought of as a lumberjack hat, which was very silly but also somehow completely appropriate. It was red plaid flannel lined with faux fur, and it had huge ear flaps. He looked like he was ready to cross the Arctic, not walk half a block to get lunch. Looking at him made Nick want to both laugh and cry. Vash looked ridiculous, and what was more, he knew he did. He liked people to laugh, no matter whether it was with him or at him. But with the weather like it was today, and the storm front moving in, Nick could only speculate as to how much pain Vash was actually in. Nick was slowly beginning to realize how deep his masking behavior went. Speaking of which, Vash cast him a sunny smile and walked out to meet him. He gave Elendira a wave, too. "Hey, stranger," he said. "Long time no see." "No one's stopping you from visiting me," Elendira said, perfect eyebrow raised. Vash huffed. "Geez, nice to see you, too. How's the bouquet business?" "Adequate," she said. "But I'm here to see the other man of the house, I'm afraid." From the back, they all heard an irritated voice calling, "Trevisek, don't shout it!" And then Knives appeared behind Vash, saw the small crowd, and stopped. His standard scowl slid into place as he glanced over Nick, but when he saw Elendira, it wavered. "Oh," he said. "Hello." She smiled at him. It looked more genuine than she usually did. "Ah, darling," she said. "You said you had something to show me, yes?" Knives crossed his arms, looking a little awkward. "I didn't think you'd come over." Elendira waved a gloved hand. "It's a slow time for all of us. I'd rather spend time listening to your mad science than twiddling my thumbs at the shop for another hour." She walked up to Knives and took his arm, looping her own through it. "So, come on," she said. "Let's have it." Was Knives actually flustered? Deliberately trying not to look in Vash's direction? Nick momentarily met gazes with Kite across the counter and realized he wasn't alone and he wasn't crazy. Kite raised an eyebrow at him like, yeah, get a load of this bullshit. Vash poked his arm and said, "Come on, I'm so hungry I'm about to chew my other arm off here." Nick flicked at his ear flap, Vash laughed, and on the other side of the counter, Kite's expression changed to one of "I'm suffering alone in a sea of fools." A little bit later, once Vash and Nick were ensconced in the warmth of the diner and had started digging into hot food, Nick took a swallow of his scalding coffee and said, "So how's that playing out, you think?" Vash furrowed his brow, spoon in his mouth. He made a questioning noise. Nick stared at him. "Elendira," he said. Vash swallowed. "What about her?" Nick put his coffee mug down with a click. "She was... Did you seriously not pick this up?" Vash's bewilderment shifted into a glare. "There's a thing," Nick said, waving vaguely as though between 2 points. "They have a thing. A thing is going on there." "Thing," Vash repeated. "Knives is working on crossing flower colors, right?" Nick said. "She's a florist. He's doing it for her, or else they're working on something together. And he gets awkward around her. I've seen it before." Vash's mouth sagged open. "No," he said. "Vash, he absolutely has a thing for her. And she's flirting back." "What?" Nick put his face in his hand. "I can't believe you're actually smart," he groaned. "I know it, but I can't believe it." Vash flicked a saltine cracker at him. Vash spent the rest of lunch dumbfounded, verging on sullen, but he kept catching himself every time his smile slipped and pulling it back into place. It was starting to drive Nick slightly crazy. He wanted to tell Vash, just be grumpy, damn it, but he didn't know how to say it. Vash was cold, he was achy, his brother wasn't telling him things, he'd been made fun of, the weather sucked, his nose kept running, he was allowed to grouch. Anyone would complain. Anyone would embrace feeling shitty and give that feeling an outlet. But not Vash. He kept his face up, smile on, chatting agreeably. After they left the diner, Nick said, "Hey, come with me." He took Vash's hand and walked them all the way past the garden center, across the street to the funeral home. For the first time, Nick wished he had a car with an actual interior, somewhere he could turn the heater on and sit and talk with Vash in both comfort and privacy. But one of their workplaces would have to do instead, and the garden center's back rooms were small, and Nick didn't want Kite or Knives overhearing. So he led Vash into the funeral home through the carport door and ushered him toward the back hallway, quietly. Livia was out on a pickup, and no one else noticed them come in. "What?" Vash asked, brows drawn. Nick stopped them in the corner, right next to one of the central heating vents. He turned to face Vash, standing close, and said, "You don't have to do that. The thing where you smile all the time." Vash frowned and gave him a worried look. Nick took his arms, trying to find the line between comforting and direct. "I can tell you feel bad," he said. The thing is, I don't want to do anything to make you feel worse, but I can't tell. If I overstep, you don't push back. You can push back, you know." Quietly, Vash said, "I don't understand what you're saying." "If I hurt your feelings, you have to tell me," Nick said. "You haven't hurt my feelings," said Vash, almost in a monotone. "See, the thing where you bury it, won't admit it, that's what worries me." Nick gave him a pleading look. Vash held his own elbows across his chest, not quite fully crossing his arms, but clearly defensive. "But I'm not lying. You didn't hurt my feelings. I don't know where this is coming from." Nick felt like he was fucking something up badly and was desperate to find the way out before it got worse. "Okay, I'm glad I didn't, but you feel bad one way or another, right? I can tell, but you keep smiling and acting fine." Vash furrowed his brows again. "I mean, sure, there's no point in complaining. It doesn't do any good." His eyes flickered to the side. No one wants to be around someone who just acts miserable all the time. There it was. Nick caught the loose string and started to pull. He moved his hands up to clasp around the back of Vash's neck, forcing him to look at Nick. "I want to be around you," he said firmly, "no matter how you act." Vash stared at him, still guarded but clearly vulnerable. "Vash," Nick said quietly, leaning their heads together. "It's okay for you not to be okay. You won't run me off. You can tell me your arm hurts, you can bitch about your brother, you can be miserable at me all you want, and all it's going to do is make me want to help you. I want to know what's bad so I can try to make it better. And if I can't make it better, I want to just be there while things are shitty, so you aren't sitting in all that shittiness alone." He shifted his hold around Vash's shoulders, making it more firm. "I love your real smiles," he said, "but I can wait for those. I don't need fake ones." Nick had pressed on despite the fact that even as he talked, Vash's face had slowly fallen. By the time Nick was done, the first tears had already streaked down Vash's cheeks. He trembled slightly in Nick's hold, biting the inside of his cheek in an obvious attempt to make himself stop. Nick pulled Vash closer, into a full hug, and Vash buried his face sideways into Nick's scarf. He was silent, but his back spasmed beneath Nick's hands. After a couple of minutes, the hitched shoulder subsided, and Vash took a deep, wet breath. He turned his face outward so he could talk, but kept his head on Nick's shoulder. "That hurt," he said hoarsely. "That was you hurting my feelings, to be clear." Nick tightened the hug. "Sorry." Vash let out a long, shaky sigh. "You're not wrong," he said quietly, "about how I am. But I don't think I can just turn it off, okay? Even for you. You have to let me get along in the way I know how." Nick's stomach sank. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I don't want to order you how to be." Vash sniffed, was quiet for a little bit. "I don't try to be fake," he said, finally. Nick pulled back and kissed his forehead. "You're not. Fake's the wrong word. Sorry I said that. It hurts to see you unhappy and then feel like you're pushing me out." "I'm not," Vash told him, earnest. "I'm scared of pushing you. That's part of why I don't want to be miserable to be around." "I get it," Nick said. "So this means we just have these conversations sometimes, I guess." Vash nodded slowly. "I won't deny when I'm down," he said, "if you won't pressure me to act different." "That's a deal." Nick moved his hands to the sides of Vash's face, gloved thumbs on his pale cheeks. "You ever looked into seasonal affective disorder?" Vash gave the tiniest degree of an eye roll, but it was enough to make Nick feel like they were back on even footing. "Nah," he said, sarcasm creeping in. "Never even occurred to me." Nick gave an apologetic grimace. "Sorry." Vash's expression eased, and he leaned in the last few inches to kiss Nick. His face was still cold, but his mouth was warm, and he tasted of salty crackers and soda. Nick kissed him slow, trying to impart some warmth, still holding Vash's face. At length, Vash pulled back and licked his bottom lip. "Shouldn't do this in the middle of the day," he said. "Really makes the rest of the day a problem." Nick laughed softly. "Fair," he said. "We good?" Vash took one of Nick's hands off his face and held it. "We're very good," he promised, squeezing. "Okay." Nick took a step back, let their hands fall, still joined. "I think I have to go to work," he said. Vash made a face. "I guess I should see if Knives is making out with Elendira over there," he said, with exaggerated disgust. Nick snorted. "Dollars to donuts, they're way more discreet than we are." Obviously, I didn't even freaking notice," Vash grumbled. "Go see how the weird Hollywood glam/mad scientist meet cute is going," Nick told him. "I'll check in later. There's a service tonight." All right, Vash said, cracking a smile. It wasn't quite one of the ones that reached his eyes, but it still felt genuine, in its own way. "See you later." Words bubbled up Nick's chest and caught in his throat. He mouthed, stuck for a moment, frozen in unspoken understanding. After a second, he managed a passable goodbye. He walked Vash out the carport door again, watched him hustle across the windy street and into his own sanctuary, and then headed back inside to his office. He sat at his desk and thought about what he'd almost said. It was true. He loved Vash. No going back on it now, that die was already cast. Nick loved him, and the only thing that had kept him from saying it out loud was the fear that it would somehow hurt Vash more than Nick already had. He spent the rest of the day half lost in his own head, picking at his own worries and fears and neuroses, trying to think his way out of problems that didn't even exist yet. He managed to pull himself together for the service, remained cool and professional while he welcomed dozens of bereaved family and friends at the front door. He shook hands, murmured condolences, and managed not to think about Vash for upwards of whole minutes at a time. He gently bumped shoulders with so many people inside the viewing room, up at the front door, even outside on the steps. The deceased had a large family. The visitation was well attended. There was something warm and oddly comforting about these events, even to him, who didn't know the deceased personally. He just liked to hear lots of people telling stories, sharing memories, weaving a ghost into the room. The body in the casket was just a thing. The person who used to occupy it drifted through the spaces between people, carried on words. Much later, after the building was empty and the casket was back in storage before the funeral, Nick stepped outside for one last smoke. The garden center was dark, the rusted sedan gone for the night. His cigarettes were where they should be, but he couldn't find his lighter in any damn pocket. Eventually, he had to just go inside and get some matches out of the cabinet where they kept candles. Once he finally got a light going, he pulled out his phone to check for word from Vash. One text. A photo of a small, budding plant. Nick didn't know what kind of flower it was. With one open bloom. Mostly butter yellow, but broken with dark red striping. So dark it was almost purple. It was striking. Nick recognized the seedling tray as one of the ones of Vash's living room. Knives' love letter to the florist, Nick supposed. Nick sent back a yellow heart. After a while, Vash sent him a smile.